Hello, I'm Andrew. I'm one of the developers here at PTFS Europe. What's on my mind this week is CSS. This is a follow-up to the previous video I did where I was covering some of the functionality within the Chrome developer tools and how that relates to CSS within Koha. And so we're going to be doing more of that in this video. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to cover is CSS Overview, which is a relatively new bit of functionality within the developer tools, but it can be really useful for getting a high-level view of the CSS in a page and seeing where things might be improved. So as ever, the first thing we want to do is to go into the developer tools, so we press F12 to do that. And this should look familiar if you've watched the previous video I did. So the CSS Overview functionality, as I say, is quite new and it's not actually available right off the bat. You have to go in and enable it. So if we go into the settings here, the cog and experiments, it's within the experimental section of the Chrome developer tools. We can see there's a number of fun looking options here, but the one we're interested in is CSS Overview. So if we enable that and then close, we get the option here, or the requirement here, to reload the DevTools to enable that function. So you can see that's now been enabled, and across the top here we now have a new option called CSS Overview. So if I then click that, what happens now is the developer tools does an audit of the page and provides a summary of the CSS within that page. So at the very top here we get some statistics about various aspects of the CSS within the page, which can be quite useful just to look at and assess. And then if we move on down, we start entering the color area, and this is where we get a summary of what colors are in use within this page. So we first of all we get a summary of background colors, and then it moves on to a summary of the text colors. So we can see here that we've got quite a variety of different text colors just in this one page. And the thing that immediately pops out to me is that we've got a number of colors here that are very similar in appearance, and that may be deliberate, or that may be the result of perhaps inconsistencies within the CSS style sheet. And we can click on any of these and see a list of where these colors are used. So we can see this 777 here is used on a number of elements, and if I hover over them you can see it displays where they're used. If we move on to the next similar color, 7272, we can see that's used in quite a few elements as well, and the same with 7070. And if we click on the last one here, the 666, and we can see that's just used on a single element. I'm hovering over it, I can see that it's powered by Koha, but if I couldn't see where it was in the page, I can just click on the element itself, and then it will show me within the markup where that element actually is. So the 666 is probably a deliberate choice. It was probably decided that a unique color should be used for the label of that element. But it's quite good to be able to see all these colors within the page and to be able to see whether there are inconsistencies or other issues that need addressing. If we then move further down, we can see contrast issues are highlighted as well. So it's showing us elements on the page where there are issues with the color contrast between the background color and the foreground text. So we can see that the green button, if I click on that and then click on the text, we can see it's up at the top here somewhere. Let's have a look. Oh, so that's actually the go button on the search. Apparently there is a problem there with the contrast on that button. So that would be something that would want to be addressed. So after looking at the contrast issues, we can move down and we see there's border colors, and then we move on to fonts. We get a summary of all the fonts that are used on the page, which again can be very useful if you're sort of assessing, doing an audit of all the fonts that are in use, looking for font inconsistencies, that kind of thing. And then we get down to unused declarations, which is declarations within the CSS style sheet that are not actually used on the page, or are declared but will never actually be used because of the markup that's actually appearing in the page. So that can be very useful for reducing page load sizes, because you're reducing CSS declarations that are not actually used. And then finally, we move on to media queries. So this gives you a summary of any media queries you've got in your style sheet and how they will affect the display of the page. So that's CSS Overview, which is a very good way, as I say, of just getting a high-level view of the CSS in a page. Another useful ability is to be able to find elements within a page by their CSS selector, so by their class or their ID. So there's quite a lot going on in this page here, and maybe I know that somewhere in this page there's a login modal, and I've looked in my CSS and I can see that it's got an ID of login modal, but I have no idea where it is. So what I can do is if I press Control F within the elements view here, I can search by a number of criteria. I can search by just a string, so I could search just using a string if I know there's a string of text within the page, or I can use a selector, as you can see there. So if I type, I know it's got an ID of login modal, so if I type in login modal, we can see that instantly takes us to the element I was looking for. So this can be very useful if you're, for example, looking through your user CSS within Koha, and you're wondering whereabouts in a page a particular style is used. So you can type in the style name here, and then if there was more than one element, they would all be highlighted. So you can then very easily find these elements within the page. Imagine a scenario where you need to style an element in a page, but you're not quite sure how to target that element within the markup. This can be a problem if you've got a very nested element, or if you've got an element that doesn't have a CSS class or an ID. It can be a real problem trying to figure out how to target that element. One easy way of finding the selector for an element is to choose it. Just click on it and then right click and choose Copy Selector. What that does is copy into the clipboard a CSS selector for that element. So if we refer back to the previous tip I just gave and do Control F, we can see if we paste what's in our clipboard into the search, that's what we've got from the selector for that element. What you will get is a selector that's very specific. It may be too specific depending on your use case, but it's often a good starting point to work out how to target an element. And oftentimes, if you're targeting an element that doesn't have a CSS class or an ID, you'll often get a selector based on its position within a list or some other, what could be considered to be a fragile selector. It would break if the markup was to change around that element. So that's just something to keep in mind. But certainly as a way of getting a starting point for a CSS selector for an element that may be tricky to get otherwise, this is a very good place to start. Well, that's all for this video. I hope it's been useful, and thanks very much for watching. Bye.